Recently, a Shiftry card from the next Destiny set has been announced as being banned from the expanded format beginning this year. Not too long ago before that, we learned that Lysander's Trump card is banned for all formats. The last time we had a banned card in the trading card game standard format was way back in the Neo Genesis days when Sneasel and Slowking were banned. The only other card ever banned from an official event was Wormadam for the 2008 North American Professor Cup. But why were these cards banned? If they're too good to be used, why were they printed in the first place? Well, a lot of factors were considered when banning each of these cards. First, it's worth making the distinction between a banned card and a censored card. You remember this? The card depicting Misty underwater, seemingly without clothes on? How about this card, printed much more recently, showing a Magmortar from the Japanese equivalent of Dragons Exalted? Several of these cards have been printed in Japanese with artwork that appears very different from what eventually is printed in the rest of the world. Japanese culture is simply different from that of the majority of other countries. In Japan, it's perfectly fine to show Magmortar aiming its guns at the viewer. In America, for obvious reasons, it's not. This is the artwork we received. This doesn't make the original card banned, just censored. This means it was still printed and still perfectly legal to use in the trading card game competitive play, but with different artwork. Now that the distinction is made, let's take a look at the card that made the biggest news when its ban was announced, Lysander's Trump card. At the time of its ban, it was in almost every single deck in the game. People ran one or even two of this card and used it to consistently shuffle their entire discard pile back into their deck. This card, paired with VS Seeker, was able to do this multiple times in a game. Players were able to go through their entire deck without worry, which created an uncompetitive atmosphere. This card also removed one of the win conditions of the game, decking out. Due to this, games constantly went to time and ended in draws. There were multiple other factors that were considered, but that's the gist of it. So if it was so good, why was it printed at all in the first place? That is a great question and no one really knows for sure. However, it's quite likely that the creators of the TCG simply wanted to try a new card out and see if people made it work. Too bad for them, it worked too well and was banned a mere 6 months after its release. What about cards that have been around for years, like Shiftry? It was printed in Next Destinies from 2012. It is just now seeing a ban and it's not even in the standard format anymore. You can only play this card in an official regionals event. What was so powerful about it that we suddenly couldn't use it even though it never saw any use prior to now? Well, one big card from Ancient Origins is Forest of Giant Plants. It allows grass-type Pokemon to evolve immediately without having to wait a turn first like normal. This allows Seedot to evolve into Nuzleaf, and then Nuzleaf to evolve into Shiftry all within the first turn. Never mind that Shiftry is a dark type, the Stadium card allows it to evolve from a grass-type Pokemon immediately. Shiftry's Giant Fan ability allows it to have a 50-50 chance of shuffling one of your opponent's Pokemon in play back into their deck. If you can get 3 or 4 Shiftry off in a single turn, or even more, which is completely possible due to the Forest of Giant Plants and the de-evolution spray item from Dragons Exalted, then your opponent loses the game before it even begins. Long story short, without Forest of Giant Plants, Shiftry is just not as powerful. You would have to wait several turns to get it into play, and then after you de-evolve it, you'd have to wait another turn to re-evolve it. During that time, your opponent can come up with ways to counter the Giant Fan strategy, or more likely, just knock out your Shiftry or its previous evolutions. It makes sense then to ban Shiftry from the expanded format. Now that we've talked about the most recent banned cards, let's go back and talk about the very first cards to ever be banned, Sneasel and Slowking. Sneasel was banned because, at the time, it was able to put out way too much damage. In the days when Pokemon HP maxed out at 120, Sneasel's beat-up attack, which could potentially dish out 140 damage within just the second turn, turned out to be a huge problem. Combined with a 0 retreat cost and the ease of setting it up, Sneasel turned out to be more powerful than anyone could have imagined at the time of its original release, and so it was banned. It was reprinted years later in the HS Unleashed set, with the only exceptions being its added weakness and nerfed resistance, but by then, 140 damage was not as big of a threat as it used to be, especially since Sneasel, at 60 HP, could so easily be knocked out before it was set up. What about Slowking? Well, its ban was due to a very unique case. When it was translated into English, its Pokemon power was intentionally changed. Yes, intentionally, believe it or not. In Japanese, its Pokemon power, Mind Games, only worked when it was active. It stated when your opponent plays a trainer card, you flip a coin. If heads, the trainer card does nothing and it goes on top of their deck. Back then, there were no distinctions between items and stadiums and supporters. They were all the same trainer cards. So unless your opponent was playing down a Pokemon or energy, there was only a 50-50 chance the card would have any effect. Again, this already sounds like a card that's too good, so why was it even printed? Well, remember when I said they made an intentional translation change? Here's the change. In the original Japanese, the Pokemon power only worked when Slowking was active. When it was active, while your opponent only had a 50-50 chance of their trainer cards working, they could still power up a Pokemon, knock out the Slowking, and eventually knock out enough to get their trainers back. In the translation, the Pokemon power worked regardless of whether Slowking was active or not. This meant that players could set up multiple Slowking cards and have the Pokemon power stack. If you had 4 Slowking in play, your opponent, instead of having a 1 in 2 chance of their trainer cards working, suddenly only had a 1 in 16 chance. By the time the card was banned, the format was simply seeing who could get a Slowking out first. The 5th and final card that has ever been banned has the unique distinction of only being banned at one tournament, Wormadam. This Sandy Cloak variant was banned from the 2008 North American Professor Cup. One of the rules of the Professor Cup was that only common and uncommon cards were legal, and Wormadam was reprinted in Pop 7 as an uncommon. Its Pokebody, which works similar to an ability in the current format, prevented all effective attacks done to it except damage. This, combined with its attack, Pushover, which allowed it to potentially deal enough damage to knock out anything in one hit, made it one of the most powerful uncommon Pokemon cards ever. It was allowed in the European Professor Cup, but dominated so much there that it was banned in the North American Professor Cup, which took place shortly afterward. In the standard format, Wormadam wasn't a huge threat, since it only had 80 HP and thus could easily be knocked out by several large decks at the time. But when those decks were taken away, Wormadam was just too powerful. So in conclusion, each time a card is banned from the trading card game, several factors are considered. Each banned card is a unique case. While we only have 5 banned cards right now, it's likely, with the end of Pokemon nowhere in sight, that they will someday be joined by another card that turned out to be way too good. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I hope that it was informative to you. Thanks everyone for watching, and stay tuned for more.